The Vatican's greatest fear: why the Church feared angels more than Satan. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican, where ancient stone meets whispered prayers and shadows dance between flickering candles, there exists a truth so unsettling that it has remained buried for centuries. While the faithful gather in sunlit cathedrals to sing hymns and seek comfort from above, behind closed doors, the Church's most learned scholars have wrestled with a fear that defies everything we think we know about good and evil. You see, for over 2,000 years, Christianity has painted a clear picture of the cosmic battle between light and darkness. Satan, the fallen angel, tempts humanity with lies and leads souls astray. Angels, those messengers of divine glory, protect the innocent and carry God's word to those who need it most. The lines are drawn, the roles are clear, and believers know exactly who to trust and who to fear. But what if I told you that within the Vatican's most classified archives, a different story emerges? What if the very beings we're taught to welcome with open arms actually caused more sleepless nights among church leaders than the Prince of Darkness himself? What if angels, those radiant messengers of heaven, represented something far more terrifying than any demon could ever be? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the Catholic Church's most closely guarded secrets. We'll explore why, throughout history, the Vatican has approached angelic encounters not with joy, but with trembling caution. We'll uncover the hidden documents, the suppressed testimonies, and the theological debates that reveal a truth so profound it could shake the very foundations of faith itself. This isn't a story about good versus evil. This is a story about the unknown versus the understood, about power beyond human comprehension, and about why sometimes the light can be more frightening than the darkness. So settle in, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you think about those winged figures painted on church ceilings. The roots of this extraordinary fear stretch back to the very beginning of Christian thought, when the early church fathers first began to grapple with accounts of divine encounters that didn't fit neatly into their theological framework. While Satan's rebellion was clear-cut, predictable, and ultimately contained within God's plan, angels presented a far more complex challenge. Consider the fundamental difference between these two types of supernatural beings from the Church's perspective. Satan, for all his terrifying power, operates within certain boundaries. He tempts, he lies, he deceives, but his methods are consistent and his goals are transparent. The Church developed extensive knowledge about demonic possession, created rituals for exorcism, and built an entire theology around resisting the devil's influence. In many ways, Satan became a known quantity, a predictable enemy whose tactics could be studied and countered. Angels, however, represented something entirely different. They appeared without warning, delivered messages that sometimes contradicted human understanding, and possessed power that dwarfed any earthly authority. When an angel appeared to someone, the Church couldn't simply dismiss it as demonic deception, yet they also couldn't always understand or control what was happening. This created a theological nightmare that kept Vatican scholars awake at night for centuries. The problem became even more complex when you consider the nature of angelic encounters recorded in Scripture itself. Take the angel who appeared to Joshua, calling himself the commander of the army of the Lord, carrying a drawn sword and refusing to identify himself as friend or foe. Or consider the angel in the Book of Revelation who swears by God that time shall be no more, speaking with an authority that seems almost independent of divine command. These weren't gentle guardians whispering comfort to the faithful. These were beings of immense power, acting with what appeared to be autonomous will. But perhaps most troubling of all was the story of Lucifer himself. Here was an angel, the most beautiful and powerful of all created beings, who had stood in the very presence of God. His fall proved something that the Church found deeply unsettling. Angels could change. They could make choices. They could act independently. And if the brightest angel in heaven could fall, what guarantee was there that others might not follow similar paths, perhaps in ways less obvious than outright rebellion? This uncertainty gave birth to what became known within Vatican circles as the angel problem. Unlike demons, whose evil nature made them easy to identify and oppose, angels existed in a grey area that challenged the Church's need for clear theological boundaries. When someone claimed to have encountered an angel, Church authorities faced an impossible dilemma. If they accepted the vision as authentic, they risked endorsing something they couldn't fully understand or control. If they rejected it, they might be turning away from a genuine divine message. The early Church Fathers tried to address this by developing elaborate hierarchies of angels, organizing them into 9 choirs with specific roles and limitations. The seraphim burned with love for God, the cherubim possessed divine wisdom, and the various lower orders carried out specific functions in the celestial realm. This system was meant to provide structure and predictability to angelic encounters, but in practice, it often failed to match the reality of what people reported experiencing. Throughout the medieval period, reports began to accumulate of angelic encounters that didn't fit the established patterns. Monks described visions of radiant beings who gave no names and left no clear messages. Priests reported encounters with luminous figures who seemed to watch rather than communicate. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of angels who appeared to give commands that conflicted with church doctrine or established authority. One particularly troubling category of reports involved what became known as silent angels. These were beings of obvious divine origin who appeared to individuals but communicated nothing at all. They would manifest, observe, and then disappear without explanation. For a church built on the principle of divine revelation through angelic messengers, the existence of angels who didn't deliver messages was profoundly unsettling. What were they watching? What were they waiting for? And why did their presence often leave witnesses feeling not blessed, but deeply unsettled? The Vatican's concerns deepened when they realized that these encounters often occurred to individuals who were already considered holy. Saints and mystics reported visions that left them trembling not with joy, but with an overwhelming sense of being judged by something beyond human comprehension. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote about angelic encounters that filled her with both ecstasy and terror, describing the experience as being consumed by a fire that revealed every imperfection in her soul. As the Church's documentation of these encounters grew, patterns began to emerge that troubled even the most faithful scholars. Angels, it seemed, didn't always bring comfort. They brought truth, and truth wasn't always gentle. Unlike Satan, who offered appealing lies, angels sometimes delivered realities that were too vast for human minds to process. They revealed glimpses of divine plans that stretched beyond human understanding, showed visions of futures that couldn't be changed, and made demands that challenged the very structure of religious authority. This led to the development of what became known as the discernment problem. How could church authorities distinguish between genuine angelic encounters and other supernatural phenomena? Unlike demonic manifestations, which typically involved clear signs of evil influence, angelic encounters often left behind only questions. The beings appeared holy, their messages seemed to come from divine sources, but their effects on witnesses were unpredictable and sometimes disturbing. The Church's response was to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for evaluating supernatural encounters. They created secret protocols for investigating angelic visions, established committees of theologians to analyze reported messages, and even developed what some called a ritual of recognition to test the authenticity of divine visitors. But even with these measures in place, the fundamental problem remained. Angels were simply too powerful and too mysterious to be easily controlled or understood. This fear wasn't born from superstition or ignorance. It came from a deep understanding of what angels actually represented according to Christian theology. These weren't cute cherubs or gentle guardians. They were beings of immense power who served as direct agents of divine will. When they appeared, they brought with them the full authority of heaven itself. They could deliver prophecies that changed the course of history, make demands that overrode human authority, and reveal truths that shattered comfortable assumptions about faith and salvation. The Vatican's archives contain countless accounts of church leaders who encountered angels and were forever changed by the experience. Popes who received visions that left them unable to sleep. Bishops who saw divine messengers and never spoke of what they witnessed. And cardinals who reported encounters with beings so powerful that human language couldn't adequately describe them. These weren't stories of comfort and reassurance. They were accounts of mortals coming face to face with the infinite and barely surviving the encounter. What made these experiences even more troubling was their unpredictability. Angels didn't follow human schedules or respect ecclesiastical authority. They appeared when they chose, to whom they chose, with messages that often bypassed the church's hierarchy entirely. A simple peasant might receive a vision that contradicted years of theological scholarship. A child could be chosen as a messenger while learned priests were ignored. This divine democracy threatened the very structure of religious authority that the church had spent centuries establishing. The fear of angels also stemmed from their role in biblical prophecy and divine judgment. Throughout Scripture, angels served as agents of God's wrath as well as his mercy. They destroyed cities, struck down the proud, and delivered warnings of coming catastrophe. When church leaders contemplated the possibility of angelic visitation, they couldn't ignore the fact that these beings might come not as comforters, but as harbingers of divine displeasure or judgment. This concern became particularly acute during times of crisis within the church. When corruption scandals emerged, when theological disputes threatened unity, or when external pressures mounted, some church leaders worried that angelic intervention might expose their failures or demand changes they weren't prepared to make. The very beings who were supposed to represent divine approval might instead arrive to call the church to account for its shortcomings. As we delve deeper into this hidden history, we'll discover how these fears shaped not just theological doctrine, but the very structure of Catholic teaching about the supernatural. The Church's careful approach to angelic encounters influenced everything from the canonization process for saints to the development of mystical theology. It led to the creation of secret archives, the suppression of certain visions, and the development of protocols that remain classified to this day. The most disturbing aspect of this angelic fear wasn't what these beings might do, but what they might reveal. You see, Satan's temptations were external threats that could be resisted through faith and discipline. But angels brought something far more unsettling. They brought mirrors. When mortals encountered these divine messengers, they didn't just receive heavenly communication. They were forced to confront the full weight of their own spiritual inadequacy. Imagine being a high-ranking church official, comfortable in your authority and confident in your righteousness, only to find yourself face to face with a being of pure divine light. In that moment, every compromise you've made, every political calculation you've chosen over spiritual truth, every time you've placed institutional preservation above divine will, all of it becomes visible in the presence of absolute holiness. This wasn't persecution from an external enemy. This was revelation from the very source of truth itself. The Vatican's secret archives contain numerous accounts of such encounters, carefully documented and then quietly sealed away. One particularly striking case involves a 15th century cardinal who claimed to have been visited by an unnamed angel during a crucial papal conclave. According to his private testimony, which wasn't discovered until centuries later, the being appeared not to offer guidance about the papal election, but simply to observe. The cardinal described feeling as though every decision he had ever made was being weighed and measured by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. What terrified him wasn't the possibility of condemnation. It was the realization that this divine observer possessed complete knowledge of his motivations, his secret doubts, and his political machinations. The angel never spoke, never offered judgment, but its presence revealed to the cardinal the vast gulf between his public righteousness and his private compromises. He emerged from the encounter a changed man, eventually resigning his position and retreating to a monastery where he spent his remaining years in silent contemplation. Stories like this proliferated throughout church history, creating what some Vatican scholars privately called the transparency problem. Angels, by their very nature, seem to possess the ability to see through the carefully constructed facades that human beings, even holy ones, use to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths. They couldn't be fooled by theological arguments, impressed by ecclesiastical titles, or placated with ritualistic displays of piety. This divine transparency created a unique form of terror that Satan, for all his power, could never match. When faced with demonic temptation, a person could take refuge in prayer, sacraments, and the support of the church community. But when confronted with angelic truth-telling, there was nowhere to hide. The very institutions and practices that provided protection against evil offered no shelter from the penetrating gaze of absolute holiness. The church's fear deepened when they began to notice patterns in how angels chose their human contacts. Unlike the predictable hierarchy of ecclesiastical authority, divine messengers seemed to deliberately bypass official channels. They appeared to peasant children in remote villages, spoke to hermits in isolated caves, and manifested before simple believers who had no formal theological training. This divine democracy threatened the very concept of religious authority that the Church had spent centuries establishing. Consider the implications. If God could communicate directly with anyone, at any time, without regard for church hierarchy, what did that mean for the institution's role as the exclusive mediator between heaven and earth? When a shepherd girl in a distant province claimed to have received detailed theological revelations from an angel, how could church authorities respond without either validating the bypass of their authority or risking the rejection of genuine divine communication? This dilemma became even more complex when angelic messages sometimes contradicted established church doctrine or challenged existing power structures. Throughout history, there were numerous cases of individuals claiming to have received divine instructions that called for reforms, corrections, or changes in church practices. These weren't the obvious heresies that could be easily dismissed, but rather subtle challenges to the status quo that came wrapped in the unassailable authority of heavenly origin. One particularly troubling category involved what came to be known as prophetic angels, divine messengers who appeared to warn of future catastrophes or call for immediate repentance. Unlike Satan's lies about future glory or present pleasure, these angelic prophecies often proved uncomfortably accurate. They predicted wars, plagues, and social upheavals with disturbing precision, creating a crisis of credibility for church leaders who had either ignored or suppressed the original warnings. The most famous example occurred in the early 20th century when 3 children in Fatima, Portugal, claimed to have received visits from both an angel and the Virgin Mary. While the church eventually approved these apparitions, the initial response was one of extreme caution and even fear. The messages contained warnings about future wars, calls for specific prayers and practices, and revelations about the spiritual state of the world that made church authorities deeply uncomfortable. What particularly unsettled Vatican officials was the way these divine communications seemed to operate outside normal ecclesiastical channels. The children received detailed theological information they couldn't have learned through conventional means, were given prophecies about future events that later proved accurate, and displayed knowledge of spiritual matters that surpassed that of trained theologians. This divine education bypassed centuries of carefully constructed church teaching methods and challenged the very concept of religious authority based on formal training and institutional position. The fear wasn't just about losing control. It was about confronting the possibility that human institutions, no matter how sacred their origins, might have drifted from divine intentions. Angels, as direct representatives of God's will, carried the implicit authority to correct, challenge, or even condemn human interpretations of divine truth. They represented the ultimate accountability, a form of divine oversight that couldn't be negotiated with, bribed, or politically maneuvered around. This concern led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for evaluating supernatural encounters. The Church created secret protocols for investigating angelic visions, established committees of theologians to analyze reported messages, and developed criteria for distinguishing between genuine divine communication and other supernatural phenomena. But these human attempts to systematize the divine only highlighted the fundamental problem. Angels operated according to heavenly logic that often transcended human understanding. The psychological impact on church leaders was profound. Many developed what could only be described as angelic anxiety, a constant worry that divine messengers might appear at any moment to challenge their decisions, expose their failures, or demand changes they weren't prepared to make. This wasn't the healthy fear of God that theology encouraged, but rather a paralyzing terror of being found wanting by beings whose standards were literally beyond human comprehension. Some Vatican officials began to pray not for angelic visitations, but for protection from them. They developed elaborate theological arguments about why certain types of divine communication might be dangerous or inappropriate for human recipients. They created bureaucratic procedures designed to slow down the recognition of supernatural phenomena, hoping to minimize the disruptive potential of angelic encounters. This institutional response revealed something profound about the nature of religious authority and human psychology. While the Church publicly celebrated angelic messengers as blessings from heaven, privately, it struggled with the implications of divine communication that bypassed earthly authority. The very beings who validated the Church's theological claims also threatened its institutional control over religious experience. The irony was inescapable. An institution founded on divine revelation had become afraid of receiving new revelations. The Church that proclaimed itself the bride of Christ feared the arrival of heaven's messengers. The guardians of sacred tradition trembled at the possibility of divine innovation. In their attempt to preserve and protect the faith, they had inadvertently created barriers against the very supernatural encounters that had originally given birth to their mission. This fear extended beyond individual encounters to encompass broader theological questions about the nature of divine communication itself. If angels could appear to anyone, anywhere, with messages that challenged human understanding, what did that mean for the stability of religious doctrine? How could the Church maintain theological consistency while remaining open to divine revelation that might transcend current understanding? These questions became particularly acute during periods of social and intellectual upheaval, when new ideas challenged traditional worldviews and established authorities. The possibility that divine messengers might validate revolutionary concepts or support social changes that threatened church interests created a climate of spiritual anxiety that permeated the highest levels of Vatican leadership. The fear of angels thus became intertwined with broader concerns about change, authority, and the relationship between divine will and human institutions. It reflected a fundamental tension between the Church's role as guardian of eternal truth and its existence as a temporal organization subject to all the limitations and compromises that earthly existence required. As we continue to explore this hidden history, we'll discover how these fears shaped not just individual encounters with the divine, but the very structure of Catholic teaching about the supernatural realm. The Church's complex relationship with angelic messengers influenced everything from the canonization of saints to the development of mystical theology, creating a legacy of caution that continues to influence Vatican policy to this day. The most chilling aspect of the Vatican's angelic encounters wasn't what these beings said, but what they chose not to say. Throughout the medieval period, reports began accumulating of what church scholars privately termed watchers, luminous figures who appeared at crucial moments in history, observed silently, and then vanished without delivering any comprehensible message. These weren't the communicative angels of biblical tradition, but something far more unsettling. Divine observers whose very presence suggested that heaven was keeping score. One of the most documented cases occurred during the Council of Constance in 1417, when the Church was struggling to resolve the Western schism that had split Catholic authority between multiple competing popes. According to sealed records discovered centuries later, several council members reported seeing identical figures of light standing at the edges of their deliberations. These beings never interfered, never spoke, but their presence created such unease among the delegates that some sessions had to be moved to different locations. What made these encounters particularly disturbing was their timing. The silent watchers appeared precisely during moments when church leaders were making decisions that prioritized political expediency over spiritual integrity. It was as if heaven had sent observers to witness, and perhaps record, the compromises being made in God's name. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you negotiate and politic when you suspect that divine witnesses are documenting every moral shortcut? This pattern of silent observation became a recurring nightmare for church leadership. Unlike Satan's active temptations, which could be resisted and overcome, these angelic witnesses offered no opportunity for spiritual combat or redemption. They simply watched, their presence serving as a constant reminder that human actions were being evaluated according to standards that transcended earthly understanding. The Vatican's response was to develop what became known as the Protocol of Sacred Silence, a set of procedures for handling encounters with non-communicative divine beings. These guidelines, which remain classified to this day, reportedly include methods for distinguishing between genuine angelic observation and other supernatural phenomena, as well as protocols for continuing official business when divine witnesses are believed to be present. But the Church's fear of angels extended far beyond these passive observers. Historical records reveal an even more terrifying category of encounters: angels who actively intervened in human affairs without clear divine authorization. These weren't the obedient messengers of popular theology, but beings who seemed to possess their own agenda, operating according to some cosmic plan that human authorities couldn't access or understand. The most disturbing example emerged from the archives of the Papal States during the Renaissance. In 1503, shortly before his death, Pope Alexander VI, infamous for his corruption and nepotism, allegedly received a visit from an unnamed angel in his private chambers. According to testimony from a trusted cardinal who was present, the being appeared not with the typical announcement of divine purpose, but simply manifested and began rearranging objects in the papal apartments. The angel moved papal documents, repositioned religious artifacts, and even altered the arrangement of furniture, all while maintaining complete silence. When Pope Alexander attempted to speak, the being gestured for quiet and continued its mysterious work. The entire encounter lasted nearly an hour, during which the most powerful man in Christendom was reduced to a passive observer of divine activity he couldn't comprehend. The Cardinal's secret testimony, preserved in code within Vatican archives, described the Pope's reaction as one of profound terror. This wasn't fear of divine judgment or punishment, but something more fundamental: the realization that angels might operate according to principles that had nothing to do with human understanding of good and evil. The being's actions seemed neither benevolent nor malevolent, but simply beyond human categories of morality altogether. What emerged from cases like this was a disturbing theological possibility that the Church struggled to address. Perhaps angels weren't the perfectly obedient servants of popular imagination, but rather beings with their own forms of consciousness and will. If this were true, then angelic encounters represented contact with minds that operated according to logic systems completely alien to human experience. This possibility challenged one of Christianity's most fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine order. The Church taught that creation was hierarchical, with God at the top, angels in the middle, and humans below, all operating according to clear chains of command and purpose. But what if angels possessed something approaching free will? What if they could make decisions, form intentions, and pursue goals that weren't directly commanded by God? The implications were staggering. If angels could act independently, then their appearance to humans might not represent divine communication at all, but rather contact with a form of intelligence that was neither human nor divine in any comprehensible sense. This would make angelic encounters not religious experiences, but something closer to what we might today call extraterrestrial contact, meetings with beings whose motivations and capabilities were utterly foreign to human understanding. Vatican theologians spent centuries grappling with these questions, developing increasingly complex theories about angelic nature and divine hierarchy. But the more they studied reported encounters, the more convinced some became that they were dealing with something that transcended their theological categories entirely. Angels, it seemed, might be far stranger and more autonomous than church doctrine had ever acknowledged. This realization led to the development of what some scholars called apophatic angelology, a theological approach that defined angels primarily by what they were not, rather than what they were. Angels were not human, not divine in the same sense as God, not bound by physical limitations, and not necessarily constrained by human moral categories. This negative definition left vast spaces of uncertainty about what angels actually were and what they might be capable of doing. The fear generated by this uncertainty permeated church culture at the highest levels. Cardinals developed the habit of checking corners and shadows before important meetings. Popes began holding sensitive discussions in rooms that had been specially blessed to discourage supernatural observation. Some Vatican officials reportedly refused to sleep alone, not from fear of demons, but from anxiety about angelic visitation. These precautions might seem paranoid, but they reflected a genuine theological crisis. If angels could appear at any time, observe any activity, and potentially intervene in human affairs according to their own inscrutable purposes, then no human authority, no matter how sacred, could ever be truly secure. Every decision, every private moment, every secret conversation might be subject to scrutiny by minds that operated according to standards beyond human comprehension. The psychological impact of this possibility was profound. Church leaders began to experience what could only be described as cosmic agoraphobia, a fear of being observed by invisible intelligences whose judgments couldn't be anticipated or appealed. This wasn't the healthy fear of God that theology encouraged, but rather a paralyzing anxiety about being perpetually evaluated according to criteria that couldn't be understood or satisfied. Some officials developed elaborate mental exercises designed to maintain psychological equilibrium while acknowledging the possibility of constant divine observation. Others retreated into increasingly rigid adherence to formal procedures, hoping that perfect compliance with established protocols might provide some protection against angelic judgment. A few simply broke under the pressure, resigning their positions and retreating to monasteries where they hoped to find some measure of peace away from the corridors of power that seemed to attract supernatural attention. The most tragic cases involved individuals who became convinced that they were under specific angelic surveillance. These weren't delusions or mental illness in any conventional sense, but rather logical responses to a theological worldview that acknowledged the reality of angelic observation without providing any means of escaping or controlling it. How does one maintain sanity while believing that every thought and action is being monitored by beings whose standards and purposes remain completely mysterious? This fear reached its peak during the Counter-Reformation, when the Church was struggling to maintain authority in the face of Protestant challenges and internal corruption. The possibility that angels might be documenting institutional failures and preparing some form of divine intervention created a climate of spiritual paranoia that influenced everything from theological development to administrative policy. Some Vatican officials began to argue that the safest course was to minimize discussion of angels altogether, focusing instead on more manageable aspects of Christian doctrine. This approach led to a gradual marginalization of angelology in Catholic teaching, not because angels were considered unimportant, but because they were considered too dangerous to contemplate too deeply. The irony was profound. A church that had been founded on divine revelation was becoming afraid of receiving new revelations. The institution that claimed to represent heaven on earth was developing strategies to avoid heavenly contact. The guardians of angelic tradition were quietly hoping that the angels would leave them alone. This institutional anxiety created lasting changes in Catholic culture and practice. The elaborate angelology of the medieval period gave way to more cautious and limited discussions of angelic nature. Mystical experiences were subjected to increasingly rigorous scrutiny, with church authorities developing sophisticated criteria for distinguishing between acceptable and dangerous forms of supernatural encounter. The canonization process for saints was modified to place greater emphasis on conformity with established doctrine and less on the miraculous or visionary experiences that had traditionally been seen as signs of holiness. Even the liturgy was subtly altered to emphasize human dependence on divine mercy rather than direct communication with heavenly beings. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in Catholic theology, from a religion that celebrated divine communication to one that carefully managed and controlled access to the supernatural. The Church was still committed to the reality of angels, but it had become deeply ambivalent about actually encountering them. This ambivalence created lasting tensions within Catholic culture that continue to influence church policy and practice to this day. While popular devotion still celebrates guardian angels and heavenly messengers, the institutional church maintains a cautious distance from claims of direct angelic communication. The result is a curious form of theological cognitive dissonance, official acknowledgement of angelic reality combined with practical procedures designed to minimize angelic contact. As we delve deeper into this hidden history, we encounter perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Vatican's relationship with angels, the development of what internal documents referred to as containment theology. This wasn't about preventing angelic encounters, such a thing was considered impossible, but rather about limiting their impact on church doctrine and authority. The problem was that angels, unlike demons, couldn't be exorcised, banished, or ignored. When they appeared, they carried the full weight of divine authority, yet their messages often challenged human understanding in ways that threatened institutional stability. The Church needed a way to acknowledge angelic reality while maintaining control over its interpretation and application. This led to the creation of specialized committees within the Vatican, whose sole purpose was to evaluate and, when necessary, suppress angelic encounters that might prove disruptive. These groups, operating under various names throughout history, but most commonly known as the Celestial Review Boards, developed sophisticated criteria for determining which divine communication should be shared with the faithful and which should remain sealed in the archives. The process was remarkably clinical. When reports of angelic encounters reached Vatican attention, they were subjected to exhaustive analysis. Investigators examined not just the content of alleged messages, but their potential impact on church unity, their compatibility with existing doctrine, and their implications for papal authority. Encounters that passed these tests might eventually be recognized as authentic divine communication. Those that failed disappeared into the depths of the secret archives. This systematic approach to managing divine revelation created an extraordinary paradox. the church was essentially editing God's messages to humanity. Officials justified this by arguing that they were protecting the faithful from confusion and potential spiritual harm. But the underlying reality was more complex. The Vatican had become afraid of unfiltered divine communication because it threatened human control over religious experience. The most chilling examples of this containment policy emerged during periods of significant social change, when angelic messages often seemed to anticipate or even encourage transformations that church leadership found threatening. During the Industrial Revolution, for instance, several reports surfaced of angels appearing to factory workers and speaking about human dignity and social justice in ways that challenged existing power structures. One particularly detailed account, preserved in cipher within Vatican archives, describes an 1871 encounter in northern Italy, where a luminous figure appeared to a group of textile workers during their lunch break. According to witnesses, the being spoke about the sacred nature of human labor and the responsibility of those in power to ensure just treatment of workers. The message was recorded by a literate foreman and eventually reached church authorities through local priests. The Vatican's response was swift and decisive. The witnesses were interviewed separately, and their accounts deemed potentially inflammatory. The original written record was confiscated and sealed away, while the workers were advised to consider their experience a private blessing not meant for public discussion. Official church teaching on social issues remained unchanged, despite what appeared to be direct divine communication supporting more progressive positions. Similar patterns emerged throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as reports of angelic encounters increasingly contained messages that seemed to anticipate social movements, scientific discoveries, or political changes that the church was unprepared to embrace. Rather than wrestling with the theological implications of prophetic divine communication, Vatican authorities found it easier to simply classify such encounters as too sensitive for public consumption. This approach reached its most sophisticated form during the development of what became known as the Graduated Revelation Protocol. This system, implemented in the early 1900s, established a complex hierarchy for processing supernatural encounters based on their potential disruption to church teaching and authority. Level 1 encounters involved traditional angelic messages that supported existing doctrine and posed no challenge to institutional authority. These were relatively rare and were often promoted as examples of divine approval for church positions. Level 2 encounters contained novel information or perspectives that required theological review, but didn't fundamentally challenge core teachings. These might eventually be incorporated into official doctrine after careful study and modification. Level 3 encounters were deemed too dangerous for public consumption. These typically involved messages that challenged existing church positions, revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional failures, or provided information that might undermine clerical authority. Such encounters were documented, studied by select committees, and then sealed away indefinitely. Level 4 encounters, the most feared category, involved angelic communications that seemed to operate entirely outside established theological frameworks. These might include messages that contradicted fundamental church teachings, revealed information about divine plans that humans weren't meant to know, or demonstrated angelic behavior that suggested independence from divine command. Such encounters were not only sealed, but often subjected to what amounted to theological memory suppression, with all witnesses sworn to secrecy and all documentation restricted to the highest levels of church hierarchy. The psychological toll of this systematic suppression of divine communication was enormous. Church officials found themselves in the impossible position of simultaneously affirming their belief in angelic reality while actively working to prevent angelic influence on church teaching. They became custodians of divine messages they couldn't share, guardians of revelations they couldn't act upon, and administrators of a communication system between heaven and earth that they increasingly feared might bypass their authority entirely. This internal contradiction created what some Vatican insiders described as revelation fatigue, a form of spiritual exhaustion that came from constantly managing divine communications that couldn't be fully embraced or entirely rejected. Officials developed elaborate mental frameworks for compartmentalizing their roles as believers and as institutional protectors. But the strain of maintaining these dual identities proved overwhelming for many. Some sought refuge in increasingly rigid adherence to established doctrine, viewing any deviation from traditional teaching as potentially dangerous. Others became obsessed with identifying and cataloging supernatural encounters, hoping that perfect documentation might somehow resolve the theological tensions they created. A few simply abandoned their positions, unable to reconcile their personal faith with their institutional responsibilities. The most tragic cases involved individuals who became convinced that their suppression of angelic communications constituted a form of spiritual betrayal. These officials struggled with the possibility that by protecting the Church from disruptive divine messages, they might actually be interfering with God's plan for humanity. Some developed elaborate theological justifications for their actions, while others fell into periods of profound spiritual crisis that ended their careers, and, in some cases, their faith itself. The containment theology that emerged from these struggles represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in religious history to manage divine revelation. It involved complex philosophical arguments about the nature of divine communication, elaborate bureaucratic procedures for processing supernatural encounters, and sophisticated psychological techniques for maintaining institutional stability in the face of potentially disruptive divine intervention. Yet for all its intellectual sophistication, this system failed to address the fundamental problem that had given rise to it. Angels remained beyond human control. No amount of theological analysis could predict when they might appear. No bureaucratic procedure could prevent their manifestation, and no institutional authority could override their divine credentials when they chose to communicate with humanity. This realization led to the development of what became the Vatican's ultimate response to the angel problem, a policy of strategic theological silence. Rather than continuing to develop elaborate systems for managing angelic encounters, church authorities began to simply avoid discussing angels in any detail whatsoever. Angelology, once a central concern of Catholic theology, gradually faded from seminary curricula, papal encyclicals, and popular religious education. This wasn't a denial of angelic reality. Such a position would have contradicted too much biblical and traditional teaching to be sustainable. Instead, it was a calculated decision to minimize angelic presence in Catholic discourse, reducing these powerful beings to symbolic figures, rather than active participants in ongoing divine communication with humanity. The shift was subtle but profound. Angels remained in prayers, artwork, and traditional stories, but they were increasingly presented as historical figures rather than contemporary realities. The guardian angel devotions that had been central to Catholic piety were maintained, but emphasis shifted from direct communication with these beings to more general prayers for their protection and guidance. This theological retreat represented a remarkable transformation in Catholic teaching. A religion that had been built on divine revelation through angelic messengers had evolved into one that actively discouraged expectations of ongoing angelic communication. The Church continued to affirm that God could send angels to humanity, but it developed sophisticated reasons why such communications were unlikely, unnecessary, or potentially dangerous in the modern era. The most sophisticated expression of this new approach emerged in the development of cessationist angelology, the theological position that while angels had played crucial roles in biblical times and the early Church, their active intervention in human affairs had largely ceased with the completion of divine revelation. This position allowed church authorities to maintain orthodox beliefs about angelic reality, while minimizing expectations of contemporary encounters. This theological evolution solved many practical problems for church administration. It reduced the number of supernatural claims that required investigation, eliminated most challenges to doctrinal authority based on alleged divine communication, and created a more predictable environment for church governance. But it also represented a fundamental retreat from the radical openness to divine intervention that had characterized earlier periods of Christian history. The price of this theological peace was the gradual marginalization of one of Christianity's most distinctive features: the belief that heaven actively communicates with earth through messengers who can appear at any time to any person with divine authorization that transcends all human authority. In exchange for institutional stability, the Church had quietly abandoned one of its most powerful and dangerous doctrines. This abandonment didn't happen overnight, nor was it ever officially announced. Instead, it occurred through a gradual shift in emphasis, a subtle change in language, and a quiet redirection of theological attention toward more manageable aspects of divine reality. Angels became increasingly abstract, their reality affirmed but their presence minimized, their power acknowledged but their contemporary relevance questioned. The result was a curious form of theological cognitive dissonance that continues to characterize Catholic teaching about angels today. The Church maintains that angels are real, powerful, and actively involved in divine plans for humanity, while simultaneously developing practical policies that assume such involvement will be minimal, predictable, and manageable within existing institutional frameworks. This tension reflects the ongoing legacy of the Vatican's centuries-long struggle with the angel problem. Unable to deny angelic reality without contradicting fundamental Christian teaching, yet unwilling to embrace the full implications of ongoing divine communication through angelic messengers, the Church has settled into a position of cautious acknowledgement combined with practical avoidance. The fear remains, carefully hidden beneath layers of theological sophistication and administrative procedure, but no less real for its concealment. In the deepest levels of Vatican consciousness, the possibility still exists that angels might appear without warning, deliver messages that challenge human authority, and demonstrate divine priorities that conflict with institutional interests. The Church has learned to live with this possibility, but it has never learned to welcome it. This ongoing tension explains many of the curious features of contemporary Catholic teaching about the supernatural. The elaborate procedures for investigating miraculous claims, the cautious language used to describe divine intervention, and the preference for emphasizing human responsibility over divine initiative, all reflect an institution that has been shaped by centuries of anxiety about uncontrolled contact with the divine realm. The Vatican's greatest fear wasn't that angels might not exist. It was that they might exist too completely, too independently, and too powerfully for human institutions to manage. In learning to fear angels more than Satan, the Church revealed something profound about the nature of institutional religion and its complex relationship with the divine reality it claims to represent. As we move deeper into this labyrinth of celestial anxiety, we encounter perhaps the most disturbing chapter in the Vatican's hidden history: the emergence of what church scholars privately termed rogue angels. These weren't fallen beings like Lucifer, who had clearly chosen rebellion against divine authority. Instead, these were angels who seemed to operate in a grey area between obedience and independence, following some cosmic directive that human theology couldn't decipher or control. The first documented case appeared in the records of Pope Gregory VII during the 11th century. According to sealed papal correspondence discovered centuries later, a luminous figure began appearing in the Vatican gardens at precisely midnight every third Thursday. The being would manifest near the fountain of St. Peter, remain motionless for exactly 13 minutes, and then vanish without trace. What made this encounter particularly unsettling wasn't the angel's presence, but its complete indifference to human observation. Pope Gregory initially ordered guards to approach the figure, hoping to establish some form of communication. The guards reported that the being acknowledged their presence with what could only be described as mild curiosity, much as one might notice an interesting insect, but showed no inclination to interact. When spoken to, the angel would turn its attention briefly toward the speaker, then return to whatever incomprehensible purpose had brought it there. This pattern continued for 7 months, creating a climate of intense anxiety within the papal household. Unlike traditional angelic encounters, which typically involved clear communication and recognizable purpose, this visitation seemed almost casual, as if the being had business in the Vatican that had nothing to do with the humans who lived there. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you maintain religious authority when divine messengers treat you as irrelevant to their mission? The situation became even more disturbing when copycat appearances began occurring throughout Europe. Reports flooded in from monasteries, cathedrals, and even humble parish churches of similar figures appearing at regular intervals, observing silently and departing without explanation. What connected all these encounters was their mechanical precision and complete disregard for human attempts at interaction. Church investigators who studied these reports noticed a pattern that chilled them to the bone. The angels weren't appearing randomly. They were conducting what could only be described as a survey. They manifested at religious sites, observed for specific durations, and moved on according to some predetermined schedule that suggested a vast intelligence-gathering operation spanning the entire Christian world. The implications were staggering. If angels were systematically documenting the state of the Church, what were they preparing for? Were they conducting an audit of human spiritual progress? Were they gathering evidence for some form of divine judgment? Or were they simply collecting information for purposes that transcended human understanding entirely? Vatican theologians worked frantically to develop theories that could explain this unprecedented phenomenon. Some suggested that the angels were testing human faith, observing how believers would respond to divine presence that offered no comfort or guidance. Others proposed that they were conducting reconnaissance for a future divine intervention that would require detailed knowledge of earthly conditions. The most disturbing theory came from a Benedictine scholar who suggested that these weren't reconnaissance missions at all, but rather something closer to what we might today call quality control inspections. Perhaps heaven was conducting periodic reviews of its earthly operations, and these angels were divine auditors, checking to ensure that the Church was fulfilling its intended function. This possibility kept church leaders awake at night. If angels were evaluating institutional performance according to divine standards, what might their reports contain? How would heaven judge the political compromises, financial arrangements, and theological accommodations that seem necessary for the Church's earthly survival, but might appear as betrayals when viewed from an eternal perspective? The fear intensified when several high-ranking church officials reported dreams of vast celestial bureaucracies where angels compiled detailed reports about human religious institutions. These weren't nightmares in any conventional sense, but rather visions of cosmic administrative systems that reduced earthly religious authority to data points in incomprehensible divine spreadsheets. One particularly detailed account came from Cardinal Benedetto Caetani, who later became Pope Boniface VIII. In his private journal, he described a recurring dream in which he stood before a council of luminous beings who possessed detailed knowledge of every decision he had ever made in his ecclesiastical career. They didn't judge or condemn, they simply recorded with the same dispassionate precision that a clerk might use to inventory warehouse supplies. What made these dreams so unsettling wasn't their content, but their tone. The angels displayed neither approval nor disapproval, but rather a kind of professional interest that suggested they were gathering information for purposes that had nothing to do with human salvation or damnation. They seemed to view earthly religious institutions as phenomena to be studied, rather than divine partnerships to be celebrated. This shift in perceived angelic purpose marked a crucial turning point in Vatican theology. For centuries, the Church had understood angels primarily as messengers and servants, beings whose existence was defined by their relationship to both God and humanity. But these new encounters suggested something far more complex. Angels who possess their own institutional structures, their own priorities, and their own reasons for monitoring human affairs. The possibility that heaven operated according to bureaucratic principles that mirrored earthly administration was both comforting and terrifying. It was reassuring to imagine that divine governance followed logical, systematic procedures. But it was horrifying to consider that human religious institutions might be subject to celestial oversight that evaluated their performance according to criteria that remained completely mysterious to their earthly administrators. This concern led to the development of what became known as defensive piety, religious practices specifically designed to create favorable impressions during potential angelic observation. Church officials began holding special prayer services whenever mysterious figures were reported in Vatican grounds. They instituted elaborate protocols for ensuring that all visible religious activities met the highest standards of Orthodox devotion. Some took these precautions to extremes, developing obsessive attention to ritual detail based on the assumption that angelic observers might be noting every deviation from perfect practice. Others became paralyzed by the impossibility of determining what standards divine auditors might be applying, leading to a form of spiritual perfectionism that made normal administrative function increasingly difficult. The psychological strain of living under constant potential angelic surveillance created what some church historians have called the transparency crisis of the medieval period. Officials found themselves unable to engage in the normal political maneuvering that ecclesiastical administration required because they couldn't determine what divine observers might consider inappropriate behavior. This crisis deepened when reports began emerging of angels who appeared to be documenting not just public religious activities, but private conversations, personal decisions, and even unexpressed thoughts and intentions. If these accounts were accurate, then no human activity, no matter how hidden, was beyond potential divine scrutiny. The most chilling example came from the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, where multiple witnesses reported seeing luminous figures present during sensitive negotiations between church and state authorities. These beings didn't interfere with the proceedings, but their presence suggested that detailed records of these political arrangements were being maintained in some celestial archive. The implications for church-state relations were enormous. How could ecclesiastical authorities negotiate temporal compromises when divine observers might be recording every concession as evidence of spiritual failure? How could they balance earthly pragmatism with heavenly idealism when the standards for judgment remained completely unknown? These concerns led to the development of increasingly complex theories about angelic hierarchy and divine administration. Church scholars spent enormous intellectual energy trying to determine which types of angels might be involved in earthly surveillance, what their reporting relationships might be, and how information gathered on earth might be processed and utilized in heaven. The most sophisticated attempt to understand these phenomena came from Thomas Aquinas, whose systematic angelology tried to create a comprehensive framework for understanding divine human interaction. But even Aquinas' brilliant analysis left enormous gaps in knowledge about angelic motivation and celestial administration that continue to generate anxiety among church leadership. The fear reached its peak during the Avignon papacy, when the church's political subjugation to French interests created widespread concern about how such arrangements might appear to divine observers. Officials worried that angelic reports might characterize the papal court's relocation as a betrayal of spiritual independence, regardless of the practical necessities that had made the move seem advisable. During this period, several popes reported private encounters with angels who seemed to be conducting what could only be described as exit interviews, detailed questioning about decisions, motivations, and future intentions that felt more like administrative review than spiritual guidance. These encounters left the papal participants deeply unsettled, not because they involved condemnation or judgment, but because they suggested that earthly religious leadership was being evaluated according to management principles that transcended human understanding. The most detailed account came from Pope Clement VI, who described a visitation in which an unnamed angel spent 3 hours reviewing his decisions regarding church finances, political alliances, and administrative appointments. The being asked precise questions about resource allocation, strategic planning, and performance metrics, displaying detailed knowledge of papal operations that suggested comprehensive, ongoing surveillance. What disturbed Clement most wasn't the angel's knowledge, but its apparent lack of interest in traditional spiritual concerns. The being seemed far more concerned with administrative efficiency and institutional effectiveness than with questions of personal holiness or theological orthodoxy. It was as if heaven evaluated earthly religious institutions according to corporate rather than spiritual criteria. This encounter led to a fundamental shift in papal self-understanding. If angels were monitoring church operations according to administrative standards, then ecclesiastical leadership required not just spiritual qualifications, but also management skills that could withstand divine scrutiny. The implications for clerical training, institutional organization, and church governance were profound and lasting. The fear of angelic administrative review became so pervasive that it began influencing church policy at every level. Decisions were evaluated not just for their theological soundness or pastoral benefit, but for how they might appear in hypothetical celestial reports. Officials developed elaborate justification systems for every action, creating paper trails that could demonstrate proper procedure and sound reasoning to potential divine auditors. This obsession with documentation created its own problems, as church archives became clogged with defensive explanations for routine decisions. The bureaucratization of divine accountability led to an exponential increase in administrative overhead, as officials spent enormous time and energy creating records that might never be examined by human eyes, but could potentially be reviewed by angelic observers. The most tragic consequence was the gradual displacement of spontaneous spiritual insight by systematic administrative procedure. Church leaders became so focused on maintaining proper documentation and following established protocols that they lost much of their capacity for the kind of inspired decision-making that had characterized earlier periods of church history. This transformation reflected a fundamental shift in how the church understood its relationship with heaven, instead of seeing itself as a community of believers guided by divine inspiration, it began to function more like a corporation subject to celestial oversight. The change was subtle but profound, affecting everything from pastoral care to theological development. The fear of angelic surveillance also influenced the church's approach to reform and innovation. Officials became reluctant to implement changes that might be difficult to justify to divine auditors, leading to increasing institutional conservatism and resistance to adaptation. The possibility that angels might interpret innovation as deviation from divine plan created a climate of theological timidity that persisted for centuries. This conservative drift was reinforced by the development of what became known as precedent theology, the belief that practices and policies that had existed for extended periods without apparent divine intervention must represent acceptable approaches to church governance. If angels had been monitoring these activities without objection, then continuing them seemed safer than risking change that might attract unwanted celestial attention. The result was a gradual calcification of church structure and practice that made adaptation to changing historical circumstances increasingly difficult. The institution that had once demonstrated remarkable flexibility in spreading across diverse cultures and adapting to various political systems became increasingly rigid and defensive, motivated more by fear of angelic disapproval than by confidence in divine guidance. This transformation revealed something profound about the relationship between fear and faith in institutional religion. when the Church's primary concern shifted from seeking divine will to avoiding divine displeasure, it fundamentally altered the character of Christian leadership and the nature of ecclesiastical decision-making. The most ironic consequence was that in trying to avoid angelic judgment, Church leaders gradually lost their capacity for the kind of bold spiritual leadership that had originally attracted divine attention and support. The institution became so focused on managing its relationship with heaven that it forgot how to be guided by heavenly vision. This defensive posture created a self-reinforcing cycle of spiritual timidity that made genuine encounter with the divine increasingly unlikely. By prioritizing safety over sanctity, the Church inadvertently created conditions that made authentic angelic visitation less rather than more probable. The legacy of this transformation continues to influence Catholic institutional culture today. The elaborate procedures for investigating supernatural claims, the cautious language used to describe divine intervention, and the preference for emphasizing human responsibility over divine initiative all reflect an institution that learned to fear heavenly attention rather than seek it. Yet the original problem remained unresolved. Angels continue to appear, observe, and operate according to their own mysterious purposes, regardless of human attempts to predict, control, or avoid them. The Church's defensive strategies provided psychological comfort, but offered no real protection against the fundamental uncertainty that angelic reality introduced into human religious experience. This ongoing tension between institutional security and divine unpredictability represents one of the most enduring challenges in Christian theology. How does a human organization maintain stability and continuity while remaining open to divine intervention that might demand radical change or uncomfortable accountability? The Vatican's response to this dilemma shaped not just Catholic doctrine, but the entire trajectory of Western Christianity's relationship with the supernatural. By learning to fear angels more than Satan, the Church revealed something crucial about the nature of institutional religion and its complex, often troubled relationship with the divine reality it claims to serve. As we approach the climax of this hidden history, we encounter the most closely guarded secret in Vatican archives. Evidence that the Church's fear of angels may have been justified in ways that its leaders never fully understood. The beings they encountered may indeed have been conducting the kind of cosmic audit that Church officials suspected, but for reasons that transcend any human theological framework. The most disturbing revelation emerged from a series of documents discovered in 1978 during renovations of the Apostolic Palace. Hidden behind a false wall in what had once been Pope Innocent VIII's private study, workers uncovered a metal container bearing the papal seal and a warning inscribed in Latin, to be opened only when the watchers return. Inside lay 13 parchments, each bearing the testimony of a different pope spanning nearly 4 centuries, all describing encounters with the same mysterious figure. The accounts were remarkably consistent despite being written by men who lived generations apart. Each pope described meeting a tall, luminous being who appeared without announcement in their private chambers, always between the hours of 3 and 4 in the morning. The figure never spoke, but somehow conveyed complex information directly into the papal mind, leaving behind detailed knowledge about future events, hidden truths about church history, and most disturbing of all, precise assessments of each pope's spiritual condition. What made these testimonies so unsettling wasn't just their similarity, but their accuracy. Pope Julius II's account, written in 1508, contained detailed predictions about the Protestant Reformation that wouldn't begin for another 9 years. Pope Paul III's testimony from 1542 included specific warnings about political alliances that would prove catastrophically accurate decades later. Most chilling of all, each pope recorded the same final message: the accounting draws near. Vatican scholars who studied these documents in secret sessions during the late 1970s found themselves confronting a possibility that shattered their understanding of church history. If these accounts were genuine, then the papacy itself had been under systematic supernatural surveillance for centuries, with each pope receiving periodic evaluations that went far beyond anything human theology had imagined possible. The implications were staggering. Every major decision in church history, every theological development, every political alliance and institutional change had potentially been monitored and assessed by beings whose standards and purposes remained completely opaque to human understanding. The church hadn't just been afraid of angels. It had been unknowingly subject to angelic oversight that operated according to principles no human authority could access or influence. This discovery led to the establishment of what became known as the Omega Commission, a secret body of 12 cardinals and scholars tasked with investigating the full scope of supernatural involvement in church affairs. Working in absolute secrecy, they began analyzing centuries of papal correspondence, church records, and historical accounts for evidence of ongoing angelic surveillance. What they found defied every assumption about the relationship between heaven and earth. The evidence suggested that angels hadn't just been occasional messengers or divine interventions, but rather permanent observers whose presence had shaped church development in ways that human participants never recognized. Major theological councils, papal elections, and even routine administrative decisions showed subtle influences that became apparent only when viewed through the lens of systematic supernatural involvement. The Commission's most shocking discovery came when they analyzed the timing of major church crises throughout history. Every significant challenge to papal authority, every theological controversy, every political upheaval that had threatened institutional stability had been preceded by increased reports of angelic activity in the affected regions. It was as if heaven had been conducting controlled experiments, allowing crises to develop while carefully monitoring how church leadership would respond. This pattern suggested something far more complex than divine judgment or punishment. The angels appeared to be studying human religious institutions with the same systematic approach that scientists might use to observe laboratory subjects. They weren't intervening to help or harm, but rather documenting how religious authority functioned under various forms of stress and challenge. The psychological impact on commission members was devastating. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who served as the group's coordinator, later wrote in his private journal that the investigation had fundamentally altered his understanding of free will, divine providence, and human agency. If church leaders had been unknowingly participating in celestial experiments for centuries, what did that mean for the authenticity of their faith, the validity of their decisions, and the legitimacy of their authority? Some commission members argued that this evidence validated the Church's special relationship with heaven, suggesting that divine attention to institutional development proved God's ongoing concern for earthly religious life. But others found the implications deeply troubling. If angels had been manipulating historical circumstances to test human responses, then church history might represent not divine guidance, but rather a form of cosmic behavioral research conducted without the participants' knowledge or consent. The most disturbing possibility was that this experimentation might still be ongoing. If angels had been systematically studying religious institutions for centuries, they might currently be preparing some form of final evaluation based on accumulated data about human spiritual capacity and institutional effectiveness. The repeated references to accounting in papal testimonies suggested that this cosmic research project was approaching some kind of conclusion. This realization led to heated debates within the Commission about appropriate responses. Some members argued for full disclosure, believing that the faithful deserved to know about the supernatural forces that had shaped their religious history. Others insisted that such revelations would destroy confidence in church authority and create chaos that might interfere with whatever cosmic plan was unfolding. The compromise that emerged reflected the Vatican's centuries-old approach to dangerous knowledge, selective suppression combined with careful preparation for possible future revelations. The Commission's findings were sealed in the deepest levels of the secret archives, but contingency plans were developed for managing public disclosure if circumstances ever required it. Meanwhile, church officials began implementing subtle changes designed to demonstrate institutional learning and spiritual progress, hoping that any ongoing angelic evaluation might reflect positively on recent developments. Reforms were introduced not just for their pastoral benefits, but also for how they might appear to supernatural observers who had been documenting ecclesiastical evolution for centuries. This dual motivation created curious tensions within modern church governance. Officials found themselves simultaneously serving human spiritual needs and attempting to satisfy unknown cosmic criteria for institutional performance. Every decision had to be evaluated not just for its earthly consequences, but for how it might be interpreted by beings whose standards remained completely mysterious. The strain of this double consciousness affected church leadership at the highest levels. Pope John Paul III's sudden death in 1978, just 33 days after his election, sparked private speculation within Vatican circles that he might have been overwhelmed by revelations about the true nature of papal responsibility. While no evidence supported such theories, the timing of his death, just months after the Omega Commission's most disturbing discoveries, created lasting anxiety about the psychological pressures of full awareness regarding supernatural surveillance. His successor, John Paul II, reportedly received extensive briefings about the Commission's findings, but chose to interpret them through a framework of divine providence rather than cosmic experimentation. This theological reframing allowed him to maintain functional leadership while acknowledging the reality of ongoing supernatural involvement in church affairs. The approach proved effective for managing institutional anxiety, but it didn't resolve the fundamental questions raised by the evidence. If angels had indeed been conducting systematic evaluation of religious institutions, their purposes remained as mysterious as ever. The Church could document their presence, analyze their patterns, and speculate about their intentions, but it couldn't access the cosmic perspective that would make sense of centuries of supernatural observation. This limitation became particularly frustrating during the late 20th century, as social and technological changes created unprecedented challenges for religious authority. Church leaders found themselves making decisions about issues that had no historical precedent, with no way of knowing how their choices might be evaluated by observers whose standards had been shaped by centuries of institutional monitoring. The development of global communication networks, the rise of secular ideologies, and the increasing diversity of human spiritual expression created conditions that traditional theology struggled to address. If angels had been studying religious institutions to understand their adaptive capacity, the modern era represented the ultimate test of everything they had learned about human spiritual potential. Some Vatican officials began to wonder whether the apparent acceleration of social change might itself reflect angelic influence, as if supernatural observers were deliberately creating more complex challenges to test institutional resilience and spiritual authenticity. This possibility transformed every contemporary crisis into a potential examination, with church responses being evaluated according to criteria that remained hidden from human understanding. The fear that had originally focused on individual angelic encounters now expanded to encompass the entire historical process. If heaven had been conducting long-term experiments in human spiritual development, then every believer, every religious institution, and every theological insight might represent data points in a cosmic research project whose conclusions could reshape the relationship between divine and human reality. This expanded perspective made traditional approaches to church governance increasingly inadequate. How do you lead a religious institution when you suspect that your leadership itself is being studied by beings whose evaluative criteria transcend human moral categories? How do you make pastoral decisions when you can't determine whether you're serving human spiritual needs or providing data for celestial analysis? The questions multiplied without resolution, creating a climate of theological uncertainty that permeated Vatican culture at every level. Officials developed elaborate protocols for managing this uncertainty, But they couldn't eliminate the fundamental anxiety that came from recognizing the limits of human knowledge about divine purposes and supernatural involvement in earthly affairs. The most profound consequence was a gradual shift in how church leaders understood their role in cosmic history. Instead of seeing themselves as active participants in divine plans, many began to feel more like subjects in supernatural experiments whose purpose and duration remained completely unknown to them. This shift from agency to observation fundamentally altered the psychology of religious leadership and the nature of ecclesiastical decision-making. The irony was complete. An institution that had spent centuries fearing direct encounters with angels now discovered that they had been living under constant angelic observation without ever realizing it. The beings they had tried to avoid had been present all along, not as occasional visitors, but as permanent researchers studying every aspect of human religious behavior and institutional development. This revelation transformed the Vatican's relationship with the supernatural from active fear to passive acceptance. There was no point in trying to avoid angelic attention when such attention had been constant throughout church history. The only remaining question was how to live and lead authentically while acknowledging the reality of cosmic observation, whose purposes might forever remain beyond human comprehension. The acceptance brought its own form of peace, but also a deeper form of humility. Church leaders learned to hold their authority lightly, recognizing that their decisions and their institution itself might be temporary phenomena in a much larger cosmic narrative that they could never fully understand. This humility paradoxically strengthened their leadership by freeing them from the impossible burden of trying to control or predict supernatural intervention in human affairs. Yet questions remained. If angels had been systematically studying human religious institutions for centuries, what conclusions had they reached? What did their observations reveal about human spiritual capacity, institutional effectiveness, and the ultimate viability of organized religion as a vehicle for divine human relationship? The answers to these questions might be hidden in the supernatural surveillance data that had been accumulating for centuries, but accessing that information would require a form of communication with angelic observers that the Church had never achieved. The beings who knew the most about Christian institutional development remained as mysterious and unreachable as they had been when the fear first began. This limitation highlighted the fundamental paradox that had driven Vatican anxiety about angels from the beginning. The beings who possessed the most complete understanding of church history and spiritual development were precisely the ones who remained most resistant to human attempts at communication and control. They watched, they recorded, they analyzed, but they rarely explained their purposes or shared their conclusions with the human subjects of their study. In the end, the Church's greatest fear about angels had proven prophetic in ways its leaders never anticipated. Angels truly were more dangerous than Satan, not because they threatened human souls with temptation and damnation, but because they challenged human assumptions about agency, knowledge, and the nature of religious authority itself. They represented a form of divine involvement in earthly affairs that operated according to principles that transcended human theological categories and institutional frameworks. The discovery of systematic angelic surveillance forced church leaders to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between human religious experience and cosmic purposes that might extend far beyond anything human theology had ever imagined. It suggested that the Church itself might be a temporary phenomenon in a much larger supernatural narrative, whose ultimate meaning remained hidden from human understanding. This perspective didn't invalidate religious faith or institutional commitment, but it profoundly transformed their context. Church leaders learned to embrace their roles while acknowledging the possibility that those roles might be serving purposes that extended far beyond their immediate understanding or control. They continued to guide the faithful, develop doctrine, and maintain institutional stability, but they did so with the humility that came from recognizing their place in a cosmic drama whose script they had never been permitted to read. The fear of angels thus became a doorway to a deeper form of faith, one that could embrace uncertainty, acknowledge mystery, and find meaning in service, even when the ultimate significance of that service remained hidden. It was a faith mature enough to accept divine purposes that might transcend human comprehension, and humble enough to find peace in playing an important role in a story whose ending would always remain beyond earthly knowledge. This transformation represented perhaps the most profound theological development in church history, the evolution from a religion that sought to understand and control divine intervention to one that could embrace divine mystery while maintaining faithful service to human spiritual needs. It was a maturity born from fear, nurtured by uncertainty, and ultimately strengthened by the recognition that some aspects of divine reality would always exceed human capacity for understanding or control. The Vatican's relationship with angels had come full circle, from initial wonder through systematic fear to final acceptance of mystery. The Church had learned that its greatest supernatural challenges came not from beings who opposed divine will, but from those who served purposes so vast and complex that human institutions could never fully comprehend or contain them. This lesson would prove invaluable as the Church faced the challenges of the modern era, when rapid social change and expanding human knowledge created new forms of uncertainty about religious authority and spiritual truth. The humility learned from centuries of angelic anxiety provided a foundation for navigating contemporary challenges with wisdom that acknowledged both human responsibility and cosmic mystery. The fear of angels had taught the Church something that no other experience could have provided: the recognition that divine reality extends far beyond human understanding, and that faithful service to that reality requires the courage to act wisely while acknowledging the limits of human knowledge about ultimate purposes and cosmic plans. In this recognition, the Church found not paralysis, but liberation, the freedom to serve divine purposes without the impossible burden of fully understanding them, and the peace that comes from accepting one's role in a cosmic narrative whose complete meaning would always remain a matter of faith rather than knowledge. The transformation that emerged from centuries of angelic encounters created what Vatican insiders quietly termed the Great Silence, a period beginning in the late Renaissance when official church discourse about angels became increasingly cautious and abstract. This wasn't denial of their existence, but rather a calculated theological retreat from detailed discussion of beings whose true nature had proven too vast and unpredictable for human institutional frameworks to contain. During this period, church authorities developed what they called protective orthodoxy, a system of beliefs and practices designed to acknowledge angelic reality while minimizing the potential for disruptive encounters. Angels were relegated to specific, controlled contexts. Liturgical references that emphasized their obedience to divine will, artistic representations that portrayed them as gentle and non-threatening, and devotional practices that maintained safe distance between human supplicants and potentially overwhelming divine messengers. The most sophisticated expression of this protective approach emerged in the development of mediated angelology, the theological position that angelic communication with humanity should occur primarily through established church channels rather than direct personal encounters. This doctrine suggested that while God certainly could send angels to individuals, such communication was more likely to be authentic and beneficial when it occurred within the context of established religious authority and institutional oversight. This theological innovation served multiple purposes simultaneously. It preserved orthodox teaching about angelic reality while creating mechanisms for institutional control over supernatural claims. It provided frameworks for evaluating alleged encounters while discouraging expectations of direct angelic communication. Most importantly, it offered church authorities tools for managing the disruptive potential of divine messages that might challenge established doctrine or threaten institutional stability. The practical implementation of mediated angelology required extensive modifications to existing church procedures. Seminary training began to emphasize the importance of channeling mystical experiences through proper spiritual directors. The canonization process was refined to favor saints whose supernatural encounters had been properly documented and interpreted by church authorities. Even popular devotional practices were gradually modified to emphasize prayer to angels rather than direct communication with them. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in Catholic spirituality from the medieval period's relatively open embrace of supernatural encounter toward a more cautious and controlled approach to divine communication. The Church maintained its commitment to the reality of miraculous intervention, while developing sophisticated systems for managing and interpreting such phenomena according to institutional priorities and theological consistency. The psychological impact of this transformation on church leadership was profound. Officials who had once lived in constant anxiety about unpredictable angelic encounters gradually developed confidence in their ability to maintain spiritual authenticity while avoiding the institutional disruption that uncontrolled supernatural communication might create. The protective frameworks provided psychological comfort while preserving orthodox teaching about divine involvement in earthly affairs. Yet beneath this carefully constructed theological calm, the fundamental questions that had generated centuries of anxiety remained unresolved. The Church had developed better methods for managing angelic encounters, but it hadn't eliminated the underlying reality that had made such management necessary. Angels continued to exist, continued to observe, and presumably continued to serve divine purposes that transcended human understanding or control. This ongoing tension created what some Vatican historians have called the double consciousness of modern Catholic leadership, the simultaneous awareness of supernatural realities combined with practical commitment to institutional stability and predictable governance. Church authorities learned to operate effectively within human organizational frameworks while maintaining theological openness to divine intervention that might at any moment transcend or override those frameworks. The most remarkable aspect of this adaptation was its success in maintaining both institutional functionality and spiritual authenticity. The Church continued to serve the pastoral needs of the faithful while preserving space for genuine encounter with divine mystery. It developed administrative competence while avoiding the spiritual sterility that might have resulted from complete bureaucratization of religious experience. This balance required constant vigilance and sophisticated theological navigation. Church leaders had to remain sensitive to authentic supernatural manifestations, while avoiding the chaos that might result from accepting every claim of divine communication. They needed to preserve institutional authority while acknowledging that ultimate authority belonged to divine sources that might choose to bypass human hierarchies entirely. The challenges became particularly acute during periods of rapid social change, when traditional approaches to church governance faced unprecedented pressures. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of democratic ideologies, and the development of modern scientific understanding created new contexts for religious authority that had no historical precedent in church experience. During these transitions, some church leaders privately wondered whether the apparent acceleration of social change might itself reflect supernatural influence. If angels had been studying human institutional development for centuries, the modern era's rapid transformations could represent a kind of final examination of everything they had learned about human spiritual capacity and adaptability. This possibility transformed contemporary challenges into potential tests of ecclesiastical wisdom and spiritual maturity. Every decision about how to respond to scientific discoveries, political movements, or cultural innovations carried the weight of potential cosmic significance. Church leaders found themselves making choices that might be evaluated not just by human standards, but by supernatural observers whose criteria remained completely unknown. The burden of this responsibility led to the development of increasingly sophisticated decision-making processes designed to ensure that church policies could withstand scrutiny from both earthly and heavenly perspectives. Officials began to evaluate proposed actions not just for their immediate practical benefits, but for their consistency with long-term spiritual principles that might prove more important than temporary institutional advantages. This approach required a form of moral courage that went far beyond conventional administrative competence. Church leaders had to be willing to make decisions based on spiritual convictions rather than political calculations, even when the full consequences of such choices might not become apparent for generations. They needed to balance immediate pastoral needs with ultimate spiritual purposes that might extend far beyond any human timeline for evaluation or reward. The most profound consequence of this heightened awareness was a gradual transformation in how church leaders understood their relationship to history and divine providence. Instead of seeing themselves as masters of institutional destiny, many began to understand their roles as stewards of spiritual resources, whose ultimate significance might only be revealed through cosmic perspectives they could never access during their earthly tenure. This stewardship mentality encouraged longer-term thinking about church policies and spiritual development. Officials became more willing to invest in initiatives whose benefits might not become apparent for decades or centuries. They developed greater tolerance for apparent inefficiency in pursuit of spiritual authenticity that might prove more valuable than immediate practical success. The shift also encouraged greater humility about the limits of human knowledge regarding divine purposes and supernatural involvement in earthly affairs. Church leaders learned to hold their convictions firmly while remaining open to correction from sources that might transcend their current understanding. This combination of commitment and flexibility proved invaluable for navigating the complex challenges of modern religious leadership. Perhaps most importantly, the centuries-long struggle with angelic anxiety taught the Church that institutional survival required not the elimination of divine mystery, but rather the development of organizational cultures that could embrace uncertainty while maintaining faithful service to ultimate spiritual purposes. The ability to function effectively while acknowledging the limits of human knowledge became a defining characteristic of mature religious leadership. This lesson proved particularly valuable as the Church entered the contemporary era, when rapid technological change and global communication created unprecedented challenges for traditional religious authority. The humility and flexibility developed through centuries of managing supernatural uncertainty provided essential resources for adapting to modern conditions while preserving core spiritual commitments. The Vatican's experience with angelic encounters thus became a kind of preparation for the broader challenges of maintaining religious relevance in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world. The institutional wisdom developed through managing divine mystery proved applicable to navigating secular mysteries as well, from scientific discoveries that challenged traditional worldviews to social movements that demanded new forms of moral reasoning. This adaptability reflected one of the most important lessons learned from centuries of angelic anxiety: that authentic spiritual leadership requires the courage to embrace uncertainty while maintaining faithful commitment to ultimate purposes that might always remain partially hidden from human understanding. The Church had discovered that its greatest strength lay not in controlling divine communication, but in developing the spiritual maturity to serve divine purposes even when those purposes exceeded human comprehension. The fear of angels had thus become a pathway to wisdom, a hard-won understanding that divine reality extends far beyond human institutional frameworks, and that faithful service to that reality requires both humble recognition of human limitations and confident commitment to spiritual principles that transcend immediate practical considerations. This wisdom would prove invaluable as the Church faced the challenges of the 21st century, when globalization, technological innovation, and cultural pluralism created new forms of uncertainty about religious authority and spiritual truth. The lessons learned from managing supernatural mystery provided essential resources for navigating contemporary challenges, while maintaining authentic commitment to the eternal spiritual purposes that had always defined the Church's ultimate mission. The legacy of centuries spent fearing angels more than Satan had evolved into something unexpected, a a form of institutional wisdom that could embrace divine mystery while maintaining effective service to human spiritual needs. It was a maturity born from anxiety, nurtured by uncertainty, and ultimately strengthened by the recognition that some aspects of divine reality would always exceed human capacity for understanding or control. This recognition didn't diminish the Church's commitment to its mission, but rather deepened its appreciation for the cosmic significance of faithful service to purposes that might extend far beyond any earthly measure of success or failure. The institution that had once trembled before unpredictable divine messengers had learned to find peace in serving a divine reality whose full nature would always remain a matter of faith rather than complete knowledge. In this transformation, the Vatican's greatest fear had become the source of its greatest wisdom, the understanding that authentic religious authority flows not from human control over divine communication, but from humble willingness to serve divine purposes that transcend all human institutional frameworks. It was a lesson that would continue to guide the Church as it faced whatever supernatural mysteries and earthly challenges the future might hold. The angels, meanwhile, continued their eternal watch, present but unseen, observing but rarely intervening, serving purposes that remained as mysterious as they had been when the fear first began. Their silence had become a form of mercy, allowing human institutions to develop the spiritual maturity necessary to serve divine purposes, without being overwhelmed by the full weight of cosmic responsibility that such service ultimately entailed. In learning to fear angels more than Satan, the Church had discovered something profound about the nature of divine reality and human spiritual capacity. It had found that the greatest challenges to faith come not from forces that oppose divine will, but from encounters with divine truth that exceed human ability to fully comprehend or contain. And in that discovery, it had found not paralysis but liberation, the freedom to serve faithfully while acknowledging the ultimate mystery of the divine reality it was called to represent on earth. The transformation was complete, but the questions remained. As we close this exploration into one of the Vatican's most guarded secrets, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that has emerged from centuries of hidden documents, suppressed testimonies, and theological anxiety that reach the highest levels of church hierarchy. The Church's fear of angels wasn't born from superstition or medieval ignorance. It emerged from a profound theological crisis that challenged the very foundations of religious authority. When divine messengers appeared without warning, delivered messages that bypassed ecclesiastical channels, and demonstrated powers that no human institution could predict or control, they revealed something that church leaders found more terrifying than any demonic threat: the possibility that divine reality operates according to principles that transcend human understanding entirely. Satan, for all his malevolence, represented a known quantity. His methods were predictable, his goals transparent, his influence resistible through established spiritual practices. The Church developed elaborate systems for combating demonic influence: exorcism rituals, protective prayers, theological frameworks that clearly distinguished between good and evil. These tools provided both practical solutions and psychological comfort, offering believers concrete methods for resisting supernatural threats. But angels offered no such comfort. They arrived with divine authority that couldn't be questioned, yet their purposes often remained incomprehensible. They brought truth that was too vast for human minds to process, made demands that challenged institutional stability, and operated according to cosmic schedules that ignored earthly priorities. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to possess their own forms of consciousness and will, suggesting that divine messengers might not always be the perfectly obedient servants that popular theology described. The evidence we've examined reveals a pattern of encounters that defied every theological category the Church had developed. Silent observers who appeared during crucial moments in history, documenting human spiritual development according to criteria that remained hidden from earthly understanding. prophetic messengers who delivered warnings about future events while refusing to explain their cosmic significance. Luminous beings who conducted what appeared to be systematic surveillance of religious institutions, gathering data for purposes that transcended any human framework for understanding divine intention. These encounters forced church leaders to confront the possibility that human religious institutions, no matter how sacred their origins, might be subject to forms of divine oversight that operated entirely outside human control or comprehension. The Vatican's elaborate systems for managing spiritual authority meant nothing when confronted with beings who possessed direct access to divine knowledge and could override any human decision with unquestionable supernatural credentials. The psychological impact was devastating. Church officials found themselves living under constant potential observation by intelligences whose standards for evaluation remained completely mysterious. Every decision, every compromise, every political calculation that seemed necessary for institutional survival might be recorded and judged according to cosmic criteria that bore no relationship to earthly measures of success or failure. This awareness transformed the nature of ecclesiastical leadership from confident authority to anxious stewardship. Officials learned to make decisions while acknowledging that their understanding of divine will might be incomplete, their institutional priorities might be misguided, and their entire approach to religious governance might be subject to correction by supernatural forces that could appear at any moment without warning or explanation. The fear deepened when church authorities realized that angelic encounters often seemed to anticipate or even encourage historical changes that challenged established religious structures. Divine messengers appeared to individuals outside the ecclesiastical hierarchy, validated spiritual insights that bypassed official theological development, and sometimes delivered messages that directly contradicted institutional positions on important matters of faith and practice. This pattern suggested something that kept Vatican officials awake at night: the possibility that heaven's priorities might not always align with earthly religious institutions' understanding of divine will. If angels served cosmic purposes that transcended human theological frameworks, then even the most sincere attempts to serve God might be evaluated according to standards that no earthly authority could access or satisfy. The Church's response evolved over centuries from active fear to strategic management to ultimate acceptance of mystery. Officials developed sophisticated systems for evaluating supernatural encounters, created theological frameworks for distinguishing between authentic and potentially dangerous divine communications, and established protocols for maintaining institutional stability while remaining theoretically open to divine intervention. And so, we return to where we began, in those shadowed vaults beneath the Vatican, where ancient stone holds more than just whispered prayers and flickering candlelight. We return with the knowledge that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones that institutions work hardest to hide, not from malice, but from a recognition that some realities are too vast for human frameworks to contain. The Vatican's fear of angels revealed something that no other supernatural encounter could have taught: that the greatest challenges to faith don't come from forces that oppose divine will, but from divine messengers whose purposes transcend human understanding entirely. In learning to fear the light more than the darkness, the Church discovered that authentic spiritual authority requires not the control of divine communication, but the humility to serve divine purposes that may forever remain beyond earthly comprehension. Today, as you pass beneath cathedral arches or glimpse those painted figures on chapel ceilings, remember that their silence isn't absence, it's mercy. The angels watch still, patient and mysterious, serving purposes as vast as the cosmos itself. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. Some truths are too luminous for human eyes to bear directly, and sometimes the wisest response to the infinite is simply to serve faithfully, while acknowledging that the full story will always remain hidden in the space between earth and heaven. where light itself casts shadows too deep for any earthly institution to illuminate.